In a windowless conference room, 3 floors beneath Vought Tower, 12 people sat watching a screen. They weren't smiling. The trailer playing before them showed Homelander descending from clouds, wreathed in golden light, his cape billowing in winds that didn't exist, his landing timed perfectly to crush a terrorist's skull beneath boots, polished to mirror shine. The music swelled. The tagline burned across the screen in letters designed to look like freedom. Homelander saves America again. The screen went dark. Fluorescent lights buzzed back to life. A woman in a gray suit tapped her tablet. The survey appeared on the monitors before each focus group participant. Question 1. On a scale of 1 to 10, how much do you fear Homelander? Question 2. Would you accept reduced civil liberties in exchange for his protection? Question 3. Do you trust Vought International to keep you safe? The executive standing at the back of the room watched the numbers populate. She didn't need to see the responses. She'd run this session 47 times in the past month, always with the same demographics, always with the same results. Fear sat comfortably between 7 and 8. Acceptance hovered near 6. Trust never broke 5, but that didn't matter. Trust was optional. Fear was the product. She leaned toward the associate beside her and spoke in a voice meant to be overheard. We're not selling heroes. We're selling the feeling of safety. And that feeling always needs a new threat to survive. The associate nodded and made a note he would never read again. Then the screen behind them flickered. The polished presentation vanished, replaced by shaking phone footage. Someone in the focus group gasped. The executive's hand froze halfway to her tablet. The live stream showed a bridge, its suspension cables swaying like broken spines. Cars hung at angles that made stomachs clench. People screamed in voices that tore through the conference room's expensive speakers. In the distance, barely visible through the chaos, the 7 hovered in formation. They weren't moving. They were waiting for their cue for the cameras to find the perfect angle for the director. No one was supposed to know existed to give the signal. The executive reached for the screen controls, but her hand stopped. Something tore through the sky. The figure didn't descend. It plummeted a streak of motion that bent the phone camera's focus, that made the person filming curse in genuine shock. No announcement, no pose, no slow motion landing choreographed for maximum brand impact. Mark Grayson hit the bridge deck hard enough to crack concrete, and the sound that followed wasn't heroic. It was structural damage barely avoided, metal groaning people lurching sideways as the entire structure absorbed kinetic energy it wasn't designed to hold. He straightened, looked around, spoke to no one in particular. His voice lost under the ambient chaos, but his lips clearly forming words. The internet would spend the next 6 hours trying to decipher. Remnant. How did I wear is this? Then he moved. A bus tipped toward the gap where the roadway had collapsed. Mark reached it in a single stride that covered 20 feet, caught it with both hands beneath its frame, and lifted. No strain visible in his posture. No dramatic pause for the cameras. He simply held several tons of vehicle and screaming passengers in the air while his other hand tore through twisted metal to reach the people trapped inside. He pulled them out one by one, set them on stable ground, and moved to the next crisis before the first person he'd saved finished gasping. A drone descended its lens, hunting for the close-up. The red recording light pulsed. It got within 6 feet of Mark's face before he noticed it turned his head slightly and crushed it in one hand without breaking his rhythm of pulling civilians from wreckage. Pieces of expensive surveillance equipment scattered across asphalt. The feed continued from another angle. Someone's phone, held in shaking hands, captured Mark kneeling beside a woman pinned under debris. He didn't speak to her, didn't offer reassurance or smile for any watching audience. He simply lifted the beam that would have required a crane, moved it aside, and checked her pulse. When he was satisfied she'd survive, he stood and scanned for the next emergency. In the background, the 7 finally moved into frame. Their formation was perfect. Their expressions were camera-ready. They arrived at wreckage Mark had already cleared, at people Mark had already saved, and began their choreographed rescue routine for the news crews, now flooding the scene. Mark ignored them. He found a car dangling by one wheel over the edge, its occupant screaming, and pulled it back to safety with the casual efficiency of someone retrieving mail. Then he was gone airborne again, before anyone could ask his name or shove a microphone in his face, or demand he explain what authority gave him the right to interfere. The focus group sat in absolute silence. On someone's phone screen, still broadcasting from the bridge, a child's voice cut through the noise. A girl maybe 8 years old pointing at the sky where Mark had vanished. That man didn't look at the cameras. Why didn't he look at the cameras? The executive's tablet slipped from her hands. It hit the conference table with a crack that made 3 people flinch. She didn't notice. Her eyes were locked on the screen, on the metrics, already flooding in from social media, from the amateur footage being shared thousands of times per second, from the narrative Vought hadn't written and couldn't control. She turned to her associate. Her voice came out flat, drained of the corporate smoothness that usually coated every word. An unbranded superhuman is the thing that bankrupts us. Do you understand? Not because he's strong, because he doesn't need us. The associate swallowed. What do we do? The executive straightened her jacket, pulled her tablet from the table, and checked the damage screen, cracked, but still functional, much like everything else in this building. Get his identity. Build his story. Offer him the contract, the lawyers, the protection we provide. Make him understand how this works. And if he refuses, then we make him the threat. Alien invasion, unregistered superhuman, potential terrorist. Whatever story makes people more afraid of him than they are of Homelander. She left the conference room. Behind her, the focus group participants still sat frozen, watching footage replay on their monitors. The loops showed the same thing again and again, a man saving people without once acknowledging he was being watched, without once performing heroism for an audience. Somewhere in Vaught's media department, an intern was already drafting the first headline. Somewhere in legal contracts were being modified. Somewhere in Black Ops, a team was being assembled. And somewhere over the city, Mark Grayson flew alone, trying to understand how he'd arrived in a world that smelled like Earth, but felt like a performance he hadn't auditioned for. The remnant energy that had pulled him here was already fading, already closing whatever hole had opened between universes. He didn't know it yet, but he'd just broken the only rule that mattered in this version of America. He'd been a hero without asking permission first. Vought International didn't forgive that kind of disruption. Below him, camera drones multiplied like insects, hunting for footage of the unbranded superhuman who just reminded people what saving lives looked like when it wasn't a product. The hunt had begun. The hotel suite cost more per night than most people earned in a month. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of the city that made everything below look small and manageable, which was precisely the point. The furniture was leather and chrome, chosen not for comfort, but for the psychological weight of sitting in a room where everything cost too much to touch casually. Mark stood near the window, still wearing his suit from the bridge. Dried blood flaked off the blue fabric when he moved. A tear ran along his left sleeve where rebar had caught him while he was pulling that family from their car. He hadn't bothered changing because he hadn't been anywhere long enough to change, hadn't landed anywhere that felt safe enough to stop moving. 2 representatives from Vought International sat on the couch. The man wore a suit that probably had its own insurance policy. The woman's smile had the structural integrity of reinforced concrete. Between them on the coffee table sat a stack of documents thick enough to stop a bullet, held together with clips that gleamed under recessed lighting. The man gestured to the chair across from them. We appreciate you taking this meeting, Mr. Grayson. May we call you Mark? Mark didn't sit. You can call me whatever you want. Doesn't change why I'm here. The woman's smile didn't shift. Of course. You're here because you want to help people. We understand that. Vought understands that better than anyone. We've been in the hero business for decades, and what we've learned is that good intentions need infrastructure. She slid the top document forward. This is a standard partnership agreement. It provides you with legal representation, media management, and protection from liability. Yesterday, you saved 43 lives. That's extraordinary. But do you know how many lawsuits are currently being filed by people who are on that bridge? Mark looked at her. How many? 17. Claiming emotional distress, property damage, unauthorized intervention. One woman says you cracked her car's frame when you moved it. Another says watching you work gave her nightmares about what you might do if you decided to stop helping. The lawyers gestured to the documents. We can make those disappear. We have teams for this. What do you want in exchange? Partnership. You continue saving lives, but under Vaught's guidance. We handle the public relations, the legal framework, the image management. We make sure people see you the right way. Mark crossed his arms. And what's the right way? The man leaned forward, his expression shifting into something meant to convey sincerity, as someone who's part of the system, not outside it. Right now, you're a question mark. People don't know where you came from, what you want, whether you'll be here tomorrow. That uncertainty breeds fear. We can transform that into trust. By controlling what people know about me. The woman's smile finally cracked just slightly. By contextualizing your actions within a framework people already understand. You're not the first superhuman who's wanted to operate independently, but independence in this space creates chaos. Accountability requires structure. Mark looked down at the documents. The top page was covered in language so dense it seemed designed to hide meaning rather than convey it. Subsections referenced other subsections. Clauses mentioned terms that weren't defined until page 47. And beneath all that legal architecture buried in the fine print he could read, despite the small font size, were the words that mattered: exclusive rights. Image ownership, behavioral guidelines subject to modification. He pushed the papers back across the table. I save people. I don't sell the story afterward. The man's professional warmth evaporated. Mr. Grayson, you need to understand the reality of the situation. In this country, superheroes are intellectual property. They're brands. They're public figures operating within a legal and social framework that has very specific rules. You can't just fly around doing whatever you think is right. Why not? Because society requires order. Because power without oversight is tyranny. Because every action you take sets a precedent for what's acceptable. The man stood, buttoning his jacket. We're offering you the chance to do this correctly, to be protected, to have resources at your disposal that make your work more effective. And if I say no, then you're operating as an unregistered superhuman, a potential threat to national security, a foreign element with unknown origins and unknown intentions. The media will investigate. The government will investigate. And when they find nothing because you've given them nothing, they'll fill that void with speculation. The man picked up his briefcase. People fear what they don't understand, Mark. Right now, we're offering understanding. Walk away and all they'll have left is fear. Mark moved toward the door. The motion was casual, unhurried, but both Vought representatives stepped back instinctively. He noticed, opened the door, and held it. I think we're done here. The woman gathered the documents with precise movements. You're making a mistake. Maybe, but it's my mistake to make. They left without another word. Their footsteps silent on carpet, expensive enough to muffle anything louder than disappointment. Mark closed the door and stood in the suite's manufactured luxury, listening to the city beyond the windows. Sirens somewhere. Construction equipment. The ambient noise of millions of people living close enough to touch but too far apart to help each other. His phone buzzed. He'd bought it yesterday after realizing his own device didn't work here. Didn't recognize any of the networks, didn't connect to a world that should have been Earth, but felt like a copy with details changed. The news alert showed his face a screenshot from someone's phone footage at the bridge, grainy and unflattering. The headline read, "Unidentified superhuman sparks security concerns." He scrolled. Another outlet. Mystery hero or hidden threat. Another expert's question, unvetted intervention at bridge collapse. The articles didn't mention the 43 people alive because he'd been there. They mentioned property damage, jurisdictional questions, the absence of accountability. One quoted a Vought spokesperson expressing concern about superhumans operating without proper oversight or coordination with established hero teams. Mark set the phone down, looked at his reflection in the window. The suit was torn-stained, marked by the kind of work that didn't photograph well. He looked exactly like what he was, someone who'd been in the wrong place and done what needed doing without asking permission first. Somewhere below, an ambulance wailed past. He focused on the sound, tracking it through the urban noise until he could pinpoint the direction. 3 blocks east, moving fast. His body tensed with the instinct to follow, to see if they needed help to do the thing that came naturally to him after years of being the person who could make a difference. But he could already hear how that would play on the news. Unidentified superhuman intercepts, emergency responders. Vigilante interferes with official rescue operations. The headlines writing themselves in his head, the narrative being constructed around his actions, regardless of what those actions actually were. The ambulance sound faded. Mark didn't move. His phone buzzed again. Another alert. This one wasn't news. It was a direct message sender, unknown, containing only an address and a time. And beneath that, a single sentence. "If you want to understand what you walked in to show up." Mark stared at the message. Deleted it. Then remembered the address anyway, because forgetting useful information had never been something his Viltrumite physiology allowed him to do, even when he wanted to. He left the hotel through the service exit, avoiding the lobby where cameras would catch him, where someone would ask questions he didn't have answers for. Outside, the afternoon sun made the city look almost clean, almost manageable, almost like a place where doing the right thing would be enough. Almost. He flew before anyone could stop him, before anyone could demand explanation or credentials or proof that his existence was authorized. And as he rose above the buildings, above the carefully managed surfaces where Vought's cameras captured only what they wanted the world to see, Mark Grayson made a decision that would define everything that followed. He would keep saving people, but he wouldn't pretend it was a performance. Below him, in a war room, 3 floors beneath Vought Tower, analysts watched his trajectory on screens, fed by drone footage. They tracked his speed, his altitude, his direction. And when he vanished from their sensors, moving too fast for civilian surveillance to follow, they made notes in files that would be shared with legal, with media, with teams whose job descriptions never appeared on any organizational chart. The evening news led with a story about the bridge. It showed footage of the 7 arriving to assist their heroism performed with practiced precision. It mentioned an unidentified individual who had also been present, whose actions were under investigation, whose motives remained unclear. It never showed the child who'd asked why he didn't look at the cameras. That footage had been acquired and archived along with everything else that didn't fit the story Vought needed to tell. The story where heroes asked permission first. The address led to a warehouse in a part of the city where streetlights had stopped working months ago, and nobody had bothered to fix them. Mark landed in an alley 2 blocks away, walked the rest of the distance on foot. His boots crunched on broken glass. Graffiti covered every surface that could hold paint layers of territorial declarations written over each other until the original walls disappeared beneath angry color. The warehouse doors stood half open. No lights visible inside. No sound except the distant rumble of traffic on the elevated highway a quarter-mile north. Every instinct Mark had developed over years of walking into situations that looked like traps told him this was a trap. He went in anyway. The interior smelled like motor oil and old concrete. Moonlight fell through broken skylights, cutting the darkness into geometric shapes that made depth impossible to judge. Mark's eyes adjusted quickly. Viltrumite physiology, compensating for the lack of illumination, and he saw them arranged in a loose semicircle near a collection of abandoned shipping containers. 5 people. 4 of them looked like they'd been through a war and lost. The 5th looked like he'd started the war on purpose. The man in the long coat spoke first, his accent thick with something Mark couldn't quite place. Well. The Flying Boy Scout actually showed. Wasn't sure you had the stones, mate. Mark stopped 10 feet away. You're the ones who sent the message. Too right. The man stepped forward into a shaft of moonlight. Billy Butcher. These are the boys. We're the ones who clean up the mess when your lot goes sideways. My lot. Soups, capes, powered cunts who think strength gives them the right to do whatever they want. Butcher's smile was sharp enough to draw blood. Though from what I've seen, you might be different. Might be. A younger man with nervous energy and retail employee posture shifted his weight. I'm Huey. Look, we saw what you did at the bridge. You actually helped people. Without making it a whole thing. That's the baseline, Mark said. Helping people shouldn't be performance art. A larger man wearing a jacket covered in tactical pockets nodded slightly. Short for mother's milk. You got a name besides unidentified superhuman? Mark. Just Mark. It's enough. Butcher laughed, the sound devoid of actual humor. Mysterious type. I can respect that. But here's the thing, Mark. You landed in a world where the most powerful soup is also a complete psychopath with a god complex and the full backing of a multi-billion-dollar corporation. You've already pissed off Vought by not signing their little contract. That makes you either very brave or very stupid, or someone who doesn't negotiate with people trying to own him. See, that's what I like. Butcher pulled a flask from his coat, took a drink, grimaced. You've got principles. Problem is, principles don't stop Homelander from lasering civilians in half when he's having a bad day. A woman who hadn't spoken yet made a sound in her throat. She was small, her eyes, carrying the kind of awareness that came from surviving things most people didn't. She signed something with her hands. Huey translated quietly. Kimiko says you're strong. She can tell. Wants to know if you're strong enough. For what, Mark asked. Butcher capped his flask. To kill Homelander. We've been trying to bring down that star-spangled fascist for years. Had some wins, had some losses, but you're something new. Something they didn't see coming. You could end him. Mark's expression didn't change. I'm not your weapon, not asking you to be. Asking you to do what needs doing. Take out the biggest threat to everyone on this planet who isn't bulletproof. And how many people die when that fight happens? Mark looked at each of them in turn. How much collateral damage are you willing to accept to take down one person? Spoke up, his voice measured. He's not just one person. Homelander's a symbol. He's what keeps Vought in power, what keeps Soups above the law. You remove him, the whole structure starts to crack. By starting a war in the middle of a city. Butcher shrugged. Wars have casualties. You want to make an omelet, you've got to. Mark moved. Not an attack, just a shift in position that put him closer to Butcher than physics should have allowed in the time between heartbeats. His hand came down on the metal shipping container beside them, and the sound of impact rang through the warehouse like a gunshot. When he removed his hand, There was a handprint pressed into steel, a quarter-inch deep. The room went very quiet. "I don't break eggs to make points," Mark said. "And I don't kill people because it's strategically convenient." Butcher studied the dented metal, then looked back at Mark with something that might have been respect, or might have been recalculation. "Fair enough. But Homelander won't give you the same courtesy. He finds out you're here, finds out you're not playing for Vaught's team, he'll come after you. And when he does, people will die. Because that's what he does when he feels threatened. Then I'll deal with it when it happens, without turning it into a public execution." "Noble." Huey's voice carried an edge Mark hadn't heard before. "But you don't know what he's capable of. What Vaught's capable of. They'll destroy you. Not with power, with lawyers and media and made-up evidence. They'll make people afraid of you. Make them want you gone. They're already trying." Butcher leaned against the container Mark had dented. "Then why not hit back? Why not take the fight to them before they bury you in bullshit lawsuits and manufactured scandals? Because fighting their way makes me the thing they're pretending I am." The standoff stretched into uncomfortable silence. Kimiko signed something else. Huey didn't translate immediately. When he did, his voice was quieter. "She says you remind her of someone. Someone who thought they could stay good in a bad system." Mark looked at the small woman. "What happened to them?" "The system won." Footsteps echoed from the warehouse entrance. Everyone except Mark reached for weapons, guns, nice things that clicked and hummed with purposes that weren't friendly. A figure emerged from the darkness, hands raised, face half hidden by a hood. "Easy." The voice was female, familiar from news broadcasts Mark had watched while trying to understand this world. "It's me, Starlight." Huey exhaled and lowered his weapon. "Jesus, Annie, you can't just walk in like that." She pushed back her hood. Annie January had the kind of face designed for billboards. But her eyes held damage that no amount of professional makeup could hide. "I had to make sure you weren't going to do something stupid." "Define stupid," Butcher said. She ignored him, focused on Mark. "You're the one from the bridge, the one Vaught's trying to categorize. Trying and failing, apparently." "Good." Annie moved closer, and Mark noticed the others relaxed slightly in her presence, as if her proximity made the space safer. "Don't let them. Don't let them turn you into a brand, or a threat, or anything other than what you actually are, which is someone who helps." She glanced at Butcher. "Unlike some people who want to use you as a blunt instrument against their enemies. Homelander's everyone's enemy, love. I'm just the only one honest enough to say we should put him in the ground and create a power vacuum that results in chaos." Annie turned back to Mark. "They're not wrong about Vought. The company is corrupt. Homelander is dangerous. But burning everything down doesn't save the people trapped in the middle." "So what's your solution?" Mark asked. "Exposure. Truth. Make it public enough that they can't bury it. Make people see what's really happening." Butcher snorted. "Tried that. People don't care. They want the lie. The lie is easier. Then we make the truth easier to see than the lie." Annie's voice carried conviction. Mark recognized the kind that came from believing something despite evidence to the contrary. "We have an opportunity here. Someone Vought doesn't control someone who can operate outside their system. That's valuable. As long as I'm useful, you mean?" The words landed harder than Mark intended. Annie's expression shifted, became something more guarded. "I didn't mean it like that, but it's true." He looked around the warehouse at the people who'd brought him here with promises of understanding. "You all need something from me. Butcher wants a weapon. You want a symbol. Nobody's asked what I need." Spoke up. "What do you need?" "To understand what I walked into, to know if there's any part of this world worth protecting, or if everyone's just using everyone else until the strongest person wins." The warehouse settled into uncomfortable silence again. Somewhere in the rafters, a pigeon cooed. Traffic hummed in the distance. And Mark stood among people who fought monsters while wondering if they were becoming the thing they fought against. Huey's phone buzzed. He checked it and his face went pale. "Guys, we've got a problem." He turned the screen so they could all see. Live footage from downtown. Smoke rising from what looked like an office building. People running. And in the center of the chaos, very clearly visible to every camera present, was a figure in a Vought security uniform, firing what appeared to be energy blasts from his hands. The chyron scrolling beneath the footage read, "Superhuman attack downtown, the 7 responding." "That's not a random attack," MM said quietly. "Look at the cameras. They're already positioned. This is staged." Butcher's expression went dark. They're creating an event. Something for their heroes to stop. Something that makes people remember why they need Vaught's protection. Mark was already moving toward the door. "People are dying." Butcher called after him. "It's a trap. They want you to show up, want footage of you interfering with the 7's rescue operation. They'll spin it however benefits them most." Mark stopped at the threshold, looked back. "So I should let people burn, because responding plays into their narrative." No one had an answer. Mark flew. Behind him, Annie grabbed her jacket. "I'm going to." Butcher didn't try to stop her. Just watched them both leave, then turned to the others. "Get the surveillance equipment. If this is going to happen, we're recording everything. Every angle they don't control." "What if he makes it worse?" Huey asked. "Then we'll have that on camera too." Butcher pulled out his flask again. Either way, the Boy Scout just became the biggest variable in a game where Vought wrote all the rules. This should be interesting. In the sky above the city, Mark pushed himself faster. Smoke and flame painted the horizon. Sirens wailed. And somewhere in that chaos, people were dying, while cameras captured their fear for an audience that would watch it like entertainment. He'd been in this world for less than 48 hours, and already he understood the only rule that mattered in this place, even saving lives, was a performance. He was about to ruin the show. The office building was burning in a way that didn't make sense. Fires spread according to physics, following fuel sources climbing where heat rose, consuming oxygen in predictable patterns. This fire occupied specific floors while leaving others untouched, created dramatic plumes of smoke that photographed well against the evening sky, and somehow managed to trap exactly the right number of civilians in exactly the right locations for maximum visual impact. Mark arrived before the 7 did. Before the news helicopters achieved optimal altitude. Before the street-level cameras found their marks and the social media live streams started multiplying like bacteria in a petri dish. He saw the setup immediately. The fire escapes were blocked, but not by accident. Someone had welded chains across them at precise points that would photograph as structural failure. The ground floor exits were barricaded from the outside just enough to slow evacuation, but not enough to make the barriers obviously deliberate. And the man in the Vought security uniform firing energy blasts wasn't aiming at people. He was aiming near them close enough to generate panic without actually inflicting casualties that would require explanation. Mark didn't waste time analyzing the performance. He dropped toward the building's midsection where smoke poured from shattered windows, where actual people were actually trapped regardless of who'd orchestrated their peril. The window frames were hot enough to blister normal skin. Mark tore through them like tissue paper, the metal shrieking as it bent. Inside, smoke choked the hallway thick enough to drown in. Visibility measured in inches. Heat rolled against his face in waves that would have cooked someone without Viltrumite resistance to extremes. He found them by sound. Coughing. Crying. The wet rasp of lungs struggling against poisoned air. A woman clutched 2 children, her body positioned between them and the flames, as if maternal instinct could function as a firebreak. Mark reached them in 3 strides. "This way." His voice cut through the chaos without shouting. He pulled debris aside, created a path where none had existed, and guided them toward the hole he'd made in the exterior wall. The woman stared at him with eyes that weren't processing what they saw, shock overriding comprehension. Mark didn't wait for understanding. He lifted all three of them with care that contradicted the casual strength involved and flew them to street level. Set them down near the paramedics, who were only now getting into position. The cameras caught him, of course. Phones raised in trembling hands, news drones descending like mechanical vultures. He ignored them the same way he'd ignore gnats, returned to the burning building before anyone could shove a microphone in his face or demand he explain his authorization to interfere. 2nd floor, 4th floor, 7th. Mark moved through the structure in a pattern that prioritized human life over dramatic rescue staging. No pauses for heroic poses. No moments where he looked skyward with jaw set and determination etched across his features. He found people removed them from danger and returned for more with mechanical efficiency that made for terrible television but excellent survival rates. That's when the 7 arrived. They descended in formation, a carefully choreographed arrangement that put Homelander front and center with the others arrayed behind him like backup singers. The news helicopters adjusted their angles. The ground cameras panned to follow. And Homelander landed on the street with the kind of controlled impact that conveyed power without creating actual property damage that would need repair. His smile was perfect, practiced, a weapon disguised as reassurance. Don't worry, folks. The 7 are here. But his eyes tracked Mark through the smoke and chaos, locked onto the figure, still moving through the building's interior, still pulling people from wreckage, without checking to see if anyone was watching. Homelander's jaw tightened in a way the cameras wouldn't catch at this distance. Mark emerged from the building carrying an elderly man who'd been trapped under a collapsed desk, set him down gently near the growing cluster of survivors. Turned to go back in. A hand caught his shoulder. The grip was strong. Not strong enough to actually stop him, but strong enough to be a claim of authority, a statement that whoever stood behind him had the right to make demands. Mark turned, found himself facing Homelander at a distance, where normal people would feel intimidated by proximity to that much manufactured charisma. "You're making a mess of our rescue operation," Homelander said. His voice carried that particular quality of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "We have protocols, procedures. You can't just fly in and start grabbing people. There are still civilians inside, and the 7 will handle them." Homelander's smile never wavered, but something moved behind his eyes, like dark water beneath ice. "We're trained for this, certified, insured. You're an unknown quantity interfering with official hero operations." Official. Mark glanced at the building, at the fire that burned in its suspiciously photogenic pattern. This was staged. The blocked exits, the barricades, the man shooting energy blasts designed to scare rather than kill. This whole situation is performance art. The smile cracked just slightly. "Careful what you say. Accusations like that could be considered slander. Truth isn't slander. Truth is what people believe. And right now, you're looking like a rogue superhuman, disrupting authorized rescue efforts." Homelander stepped closer, and Mark noticed 2 things simultaneously. First, that the 7 were arranging themselves in a loose perimeter that looked casual but functioned as containment. And second, that more drones had arrived, hovering at angles that would capture whatever happened next from multiple perspectives. Mark stood his ground. The concrete beneath his feet cracked slightly under redistributed weight. "I'm not stopping until everyone's out. You're stopping now." Homelander's voice dropped lower, became something meant only for Mark's ears, despite the dozen microphones pointed in their direction. "You don't know the rules here, don't know how things work. Keep pushing, and you'll find out exactly how much force I'm authorized to use against threats to public safety." A scream cut through the standoff. 3rd floor. Windows blown out by an explosion that sent glass raining onto the street below. Mark didn't think. Didn't calculate. Just moved. He was past Homelander and airborne before the man could process the motion, let alone block it. Crashed through the already shattered window frame and found the source of the scream a maintenance worker half buried under ceiling tiles that had collapsed when structural supports failed. Mark cleared the debris in seconds. Checked for spinal damage, found none. Lifted the worker in a carry that distributed weight safely and headed for the window. Homelander was there floating just outside, blocking egress with his body and his smile. Move, Mark said. Make me. The cameras captured what happened next from 7 different angles. Would analyze it in slow motion. Would debate it on news programs for the next 18 hours. Would use it as evidence of Mark's aggression or Homelander's provocation, depending on which narrative best served whoever was doing the analysis. Mark didn't telegraph the motion. Didn't wind up for a dramatic punch. He simply shifted the worker to one arm and used the other to grip Homelander's shoulder, not hard enough to injure, but hard enough to move. And then he threw. Not far, maybe 20 feet. Just enough to clear a path, just enough to make a point. Homelander tumbled through empty air with the grace of someone unaccustomed to being physically displaced by anything. Caught himself before hitting the building across the street, and for exactly 3 seconds, his face showed something the cameras would describe as confusion. And people who knew him better would recognize as rage. Mark landed with the worker, transferred him to paramedics, and was back in the air before Homelander recovered his composure and his smile. The building was nearly empty now. Mark made 2 more passes to be certain, found a couple hiding in a stairwell who'd missed the evacuation order, got them out. When he emerged the final time, the 7 had arranged themselves in a more obviously aggressive formation. Homelander floated at eye level with Mark 30 feet of air between them. His expression had smoothed back into media-friendly neutrality, but his hands were clenched. You just assaulted me on camera. I moved you. There's a difference. Is there? Because from where I'm standing, an unregistered superhuman just attacked the leader of the 7 during an active rescue operation. That's grounds for defensive force. Then use it. The challenge hung in the space between them. News helicopters circled. Phone cameras recorded from every angle. The crowd of evacuees and emergency responders had gone silent, watching the standoff with the kind of attention usually reserved for car accidents and public executions. Homelander's eyes began to glow. Just slightly. Just enough to remind everyone present that he possessed weapons Mark didn't, that he could cut through flesh and bone with nothing more than focused intention. Mark didn't flinch. Didn't prepare to dodge. Just looked at Homelander with the expression of someone evaluating whether the threat was genuine or performative. The glow faded. Homelander's smile returned wider than before. Welcome to the big leagues, friend. Hope you're ready for what comes next. He descended. Landed among the cameras and the crowd. Immediately shifted into interview mode, answering questions about the rescue, about the 7's brave efforts, about the concerning presence of an unauthorized superhuman who'd complicated their carefully planned operation. Mark watched from above. Saw how the narrative was being constructed in real time. How Homelander positioned himself as the responsible authority figure while casting Mark as the reckless variable. Saw the reporters nodding, accepting the framing, already writing stories that would paint Mark's actual rescue efforts as dangerous interference. Starlight arrived late, landing with less fanfare. She looked up at Mark, then at Homelander, performing for the cameras, and her expression carried the exhaustion of someone who'd seen this show too many times to find it convincing anymore. Mark descended, landed beside her, away from the cameras. Away from Homelander's carefully managed performance. You okay? She asked quietly. Ask me again when I understand what game I'm playing. It's not a game. It's war. And Homelander just decided you're the enemy. She was right. Mark could see it in the way Vaught's people were already moving in the whispered conversations between executives and lawyers, in the camera operators, being directed to capture specific angles of the building damage and the disturbed crowd. Across the street beyond the police barricades and the emergency vehicles, Billy Butcher watched from the shadows with MM and Huey. They'd gotten everything on camera. Every moment of the confrontation, every second of Mark doing what needed doing while Homelander postured and preened. Butcher lit a cigarette, smiled around it. That's my boy. Just went and pissed off the most dangerous man in America. This'll be fun. 3 floors beneath Vought Tower, in a conference room without windows, IMBIOT executives watched the same footage on screens that cost more than most people's cars. Watched Mark manhandle Homelander. Watched him save every civilian in that building without once acknowledging the cameras. Watched him represent everything their carefully constructed superhero industry wasn't. The head of operations spoke first, her voice flat. Temp Vive teams didn't work. He's too fast, too strong. We need the alternative. The CEO shook his head. Plan Z isn't ready. The virus is still unstable. Risk of uncontrolled spread, civilian casualties, complete loss of our Supe assets. Then, stabilize it faster. Because that, she gestured at the screen where Mark flew away from Homelander's stage-managed heroics, is an existential threat to everything we've built. He doesn't need us, doesn't want our money, or our brand, or our protection. That makes him more dangerous than 100 Homelanders. The room fell silent. On the screens, footage replayed on loop. Mark moving through fire. Mark throwing Homelander aside. Mark making superheroism look like something other than a product. Get me the full virology report, the CEO said finally. And start running scenarios for deployment. Worst case only. If he forces our hand, what about Homelander? Let him do what he does best. Make the unregistered superhuman look like the villain. Make people afraid. Fear we can work with. But if that fails, he paused. Looked at the folder marked with a red biohazard symbol. We have other options. The folder was labeled Project Terminus. Beneath that, in smaller text, Soup Virus, Stage 3, Unstable. Nobody opened it. Everyone knew what it contained. The end of superhumans. All of them. Including Homelander, including the 7. Including every asset Vought had spent decades cultivating and controlling. The nuclear option. For when control was no longer possible and scorched earth became preferable to losing. In the night sky above the city, Mark flew alone. Listened to sirens. Listened to the ambient noise of millions of people living in a world where heroism had been commodified and packaged and sold back to them as protection from threats the protectors themselves created. He'd saved everyone in that building. Every single person. And tomorrow the news would call him a menace. He was beginning to understand why Butcher wanted someone dead. Was beginning to see how a system this corrupt might push people toward solutions that sacrificed morality for effectiveness. Was beginning to feel the pull of it himself, which meant he needed to leave. Soon. Before this world turned him into the thing it wanted him to be. Behind him, invisible against the darkness, Vought surveillance drones maintained their tracking pattern, recording everything, waiting for the moment when Mark made a mistake, waiting for the excuse they needed to deploy the virus, waiting for permission to burn the world rather than lose control of it. The attack came at 3 in the morning, which told Mark everything he needed to know about how seriously Vought took the threat he represented. Serious operations happened during business hours with cameras present. Desperate ones happened in darkness when plausible deniability still existed. He was sleeping on the roof of an abandoned factory in the industrial district, the kind of place where security cameras had been stripped for parts years ago, and nobody asked questions about strange sounds in the night. His body barely needed rest. Viltrumite physiology operating on different requirements than human baseline. But some habits persisted from the years before he'd known what he was. The sound woke him. Not the approach they'd been smart enough to come on foot. Avoid aerial insertion that would give him warning. But the moment when enhanced muscles moving at superhuman speeds displaced enough air to create pressure waves his ears caught automatically. Mark was standing before his eyes, fully opened, already tracking the incoming threats by sound and motion. 12 signatures. Moving fast but not coordinated, their enhanced speed creating chaos rather than tactical efficiency. The kind of sloppiness that came from power granted instead of earned. They hit the roof like a tactical team in a movie directed by someone who'd never seen actual combat. Dramatic entry weapons raised voices shouting commands that contradicted each other. They wore modified tactical gear, Vought logos removed, but the quality of the equipment screaming corporate funding. And their eyes held that particular wild edge Mark had seen before in people whose bodies were moving faster than their minds could process. Temp 5. Had to be. The same enhancement Butcher used, the same temporary power that was slowly killing him from the inside. These people had been given strength they hadn't asked for and sent to neutralize a threat they couldn't actually stop. The leader, identifiable by the slightly more expensive gear and the way he positioned himself at the back, raised what looked like a modified assault rifle. "Stand down. You're under arrest for..." Mark moved, not toward them, toward the electrical junction box mounted on the building's western edge. His hand punched through the metal casing before he or any of them could track the motion, found the main power coupling, and crushed it. The electrical surge that followed wasn't just power failure. It was electromagnetic chaos, feedback screaming through every wire, creating interference that made their comm systems shriek static and their tactical displays flicker into uselessness. The soldiers' coordination shattered. Without comm links, without synchronized targeting, they reverted to individual actors making individual decisions in darkness their equipment couldn't fully compensate for. In that moment of confusion, Mark was already among them. He didn't hit to injure, didn't deploy the kind of force that would crack bone or rupture organs. Instead, he grabbed the first soldier's weapon and bent the barrel into a shape that made firing impossible, used the man's own momentum to spin him into two of his companions, created a tangle of limbs and tactical gear that took all three out of the fight without breaking skin. A woman to his left fired. The rounds passed through space. Mark had occupied a microsecond earlier, punched holes in the roof that would let rain in when weather next turned bad. Mark caught her wrist gently as someone with his strength could manage, and applied just enough pressure to make holding the weapon painful. She dropped it. He pushed her backward into a ventilation housing hard enough to knock the wind out, but not hard enough to crack ribs. They kept coming. Enhanced by chemistry, they didn't understand driven by orders. They probably questioned moving with the kind of desperate aggression that came from knowing you were outmatched. But having no choice except to follow through, Mark disabled them systematically, crushed their weapons, locked to their joints in holds that immobilized without damaging, used their own enhanced strength against them, redirecting momentum into walls and floors and each other. In 90 seconds, he'd turned 12 enhanced soldiers into a pile of groaning, disarmed bodies who'd lived to regret this assignment, but would live. The leader tried to run. Mark caught him before he made it 3 steps, lifted him by the tactical vest, and held him at eye level. "Who sent you?" The man's face was already showing the strain. Veins standing out too prominently. Pupils dilated beyond what the darkness required. Temp 5 side effects presenting in real time. He opened his mouth to answer, and blood came out instead of words. Mark set him down quickly. The man convulsed, his enhanced muscles turning against him. Chemistry that had made him temporarily superhuman now, poisoning him from within. One other soldier had collapsed nearby, unconscious, nose bleeding. The rest showed symptoms: shaking hands, dilated pupils, 2 vomiting against the ventilation housing. But they'd live. The enhancement burning through their systems faster than bodies designed for baseline human could process. "This is what it costs." Mark's voice was quiet, meant for himself more than anyone else. "This is what they're willing to pay to stop someone who won't sign a contract." He heard sirens in the distance. Police or ambulance or both, responding to reports of gunfire in an area where gunfire usually meant gang activity rather than corporate wet work. Mark looked at the soldiers, one, critical one, unconscious, the rest damaged and sick, and started to turn away. Then he saw it. A small red light on the tactical vest of the soldier nearest the roof edge. Still recording. Body camera military grade, transmitting to somewhere he couldn't see. Mark crushed it under his boot, but the damage was done. Vought had their footage. Partial out of context, ready to be edited into whatever narrative served them best. He was gone before the emergency responders arrived. Not because he wanted to abandon the wounded, but because staying meant becoming their scapegoat. If I stay, they'll film it, edit it, and the story ends with me as the murderer. Let them explain why enhanced soldiers were operating without official sanction. Let them try to spin this without admitting what they'd deployed. The warehouse where he'd met the boys was empty when he arrived, but he could see signs of recent occupation. Coffee cups still warm, cigarette butts that smelled fresh. They hadn't been gone long. A sound from the shadows. Mark turned, found Butcher emerging from behind a shipping container with a gun already drawn, and pointed somewhere that wasn't quite at Mark, but wasn't quite away either. Jumpy, aren't we? Butcher lowered the weapon. Thought you might be Vaught's cleanup crew. They already sent their cleanup crew. 12 enhanced soldiers with Temp 5 and bad orders. How'd that work out for them? They're alive. Barely. Mark leaned against the wall, suddenly exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical exertion. They were tearing apart from the inside. The same enhancement that made them strong enough to fight me was killing them. Butcher studied him for a long moment, then reached into his coat. Not for a weapon, for his flask. He took a long drink, grimaced, and his hand shook slightly when he lowered it. Yeah. That's the thing about Temp V. Makes you powerful for a bit. Makes you dead eventually. You're still using it. Don't have much choice, do I? Not if I want to stand in the same room as Homelander without getting lasered in half. There's always a choice. Butcher laughed, the sound sharp enough to draw blood. Spoken like someone who's never had to choose between dying slow and dying fast. You know what's killing me, not just the Temp V. It's knowing that every dose brings me closer to the end, and I keep taking them anyway, because the alternative is worse. What's the alternative? Living in a world where Homelander breathes. Butcher's expression hardened into something that might have been conviction, or might have been madness, or might have been both. I'll burn myself out if it means taking him with me. That's the deal I made. With who? Myself. Butcher coughed, and when he pulled his hand away from his mouth, there was blood on it. More than last time. The disease or the cure, depending on how you looked at it, progressing. I know what you're thinking. That I'm becoming the thing I hate. Using power I don't deserve, hurting people in the crossfire, sacrificing everything for one goal. I'm thinking you're going to die for nothing. Killing Homelander won't fix the system that created him. Maybe not, but it'll feel good. The warehouse door opened. Annie entered, followed by MM and Huey. They looked tired. Looked like people who'd been running on anger and caffeine for so long, they'd forgotten what rest felt like. We have a problem, MM said without preamble. He pulled out a tablet, showed Mark footage from earlier that night. The Temp 5 soldiers being loaded into unmarked ambulances. Vought executives holding a press conference, faces grave, announcing that a rogue superhuman had attacked a sanctioned security team conducting legitimate operations. Mark watched himself being described as a terrorist. Watched the narrative being constructed in real-time truth, bent into shapes that served the story Vought needed to tell. A Vought spokesperson appeared on screen, face arranged in professional concern. We're grateful our security team survived this unprovoked assault. We do not condone the use of unapproved compounds in any capacity. The irony hung in the air, thick enough to choke on Vought, condemning the very enhancement they distributed. They're accelerating, Annie said quietly. Usually they take more time to build these campaigns. This is rushed, desperate, Because he's making them look weak, Huey added. Every time he shows up and just helps people without asking permission, it reminds everyone what heroes were supposed to be before Vought commodified them. Butcher set his flask down. There's something else. My contact in Vaught's research division sent me this. He pulled out a phone, pulled up encrypted files, showed them to the room. Facility blueprints, security protocols, and buried in the technical specifications, a single phrase, Project Terminus. Viral countermeasure, Stage 3 development. What's Project Terminus? Mark asked. The end of all of us, Annie said. Her voice carried the weight of someone who'd seen too many Vought secrets to believe in coincidence. It's a biological weapon, designed to target superhuman physiology. They've been developing it for years as insurance against suppies who won't stay controlled. A virus, clarified, specifically engineered to attack compound Phi enhancement at the genetic level. Total cellular breakdown. No cure, no treatment, no survivors. Butcher zoomed in on technical specifications that showed molecular structures and infection vectors. Stage 3 development. Still unstable. High risk of uncontrolled spread beyond target population. Liability concerns in every scenario. That's why they haven't used it yet, not because they're squeamish, but because they can't guarantee it won't burn through their own assets along with everyone else. And they're considering using it. Huey sounded shocked, despite everything else he'd seen this company do. They're doing more than considering. Butcher zoomed in on a section of the documents that showed test results, casualty projections, deployment scenarios. They're running active scenarios for release, which means they're scared enough of our flying Boy Scout here to contemplate killing every soup on the planet. Mark felt ice in his veins, including Homelander, including the Seven, including me. Butcher's smile was bitter. Hell of a thing, innit? Spent years trying to find a way to kill that star-spangled psychopath, and Vaught's had the answers sitting in a lab the whole time. Just needed the right motivation to use it. They'd kill their own assets, if those assets become liabilities. Annie's voice was flat. Vaught's business model requires control. Complete control. Mark represents something they can't control, can't buy, can't threaten into compliance. From their perspective, burning everything down is preferable to losing the game. Mark looked at the research documents, at the projections showing global deployment patterns, at the casualty estimates that counted deaths in millions rather than thousands. He'd seen genocide before, had watched his father explain why Viltrumite conquest was inevitable, necessary, the only rational response to a universe that wouldn't submit. This was the same logic wearing a different face. Destroy rather than lose control. Kill rather than allow freedom. I can't let them use that, Mark said quietly. Bit late for moral high ground, mate. Butcher lit a cigarette despite Annie's glare. You're the reason they're dusting it off. You're the existential threat that makes Apocalypse look reasonable. So what do we do? Huey asked. Storm the facility, destroy the virus, and become exactly what Vaught's claiming we are, said. Armed insurrection against a legitimate corporation. Domestic terrorism. They'd spin it 6 ways and half the country would believe them. The warehouse fell into silence, broken only by distant traffic and Butcher's labored breathing. Mark stood among people who'd spent years fighting a system that weaponized everything, including truth itself. Who'd sacrificed pieces of themselves for victories that never lasted. Who knew the virus represented both salvation and damnation depending on who controlled the narrative? We need proof, Annie said finally. Documentation that shows Vaught's planning to deploy it. Make it public. Make them defend the decision to commit genocide. And if public exposure isn't enough, Mark asked, if people don't care, then we deal with that when it happens. Annie met his eyes. But we can't become what we're fighting. Can't justify mass murder, even if it eliminates monsters. Mark nodded slowly, looked at Butcher, who was watching him, with the expression of someone waiting to see which way the moral compass would swing. The facility's location is in those files. Yeah, why? Because I'm going to make sure that virus never gets deployed. Mark moved toward the door. And I'm going to do it without killing anyone. Butcher called after him. And when Homelander comes for you, when Vought sends everything they've got, then I'll deal with it. The same way I've dealt with everything else here. Without becoming the thing they say I am. He left. Behind him, the boys stood in silence. Huey spoke first. Think he can actually pull it off? Butcher exhaled smoke. Don't know. But I'll tell you what I do know. That virus is Vaught's endgame. Their final solution. And if we let them keep it, we're all already dead. We just don't know the date yet. Annie pulled out her phone, started making calls. I'll alert the networks. Get cameras ready. If Mark's going after that facility, we document everything. Began checking equipment, weapons, surveillance gear. The tools of people who'd learned that fighting monsters required becoming something harder than heroes, but hopefully less broken than villains. And Butcher took another hit from his flask. Felt the Temp 5 burning through his system. Felt death coming closer with every enhanced heartbeat and smiled. Says, because finally, after years of fighting and bleeding and watching people die, they had a chance. A chance to end Vaught's insurance policy. A chance to expose the apocalypse waiting in cold storage. A chance to prove that some lines shouldn't be crossed no matter how convenient the crossing might be, even if it killed them all. The research facility didn't look like a place where genocide was being perfected. It looked like every other corporate campus in the technology corridor outside the city, glass and steel architecture designed to suggest innovation without threatening anyone's sense of security, landscaping maintained by people paid too little to care about what happened inside the buildings they beautified. Mark approached from altitude high enough that ground-based surveillance wouldn't track him easily, descending only when he'd identified the structure Butcher's files had marked. The boys were somewhere nearby with their cameras and their contingency plans, documenting whatever happened next for an audience that might care or might not, depending on how well Vaught's counter-narrative performed. He didn't go through the front door. The ventilation system was standard corporate installation, large enough to move significant air volume, reinforced enough to handle the weight of maintenance workers. It wasn't reinforced enough to stop someone with Viltrumite strength from peeling back the external housing like opening a tin can. Mark moved through ductwork that would have been cramped for a normal person, but gave him enough space to navigate. The air smelled sterile, processed through filters that stripped out everything except oxygen and nitrogen and the faint chemical tang of industrial cleaning solutions. He followed the layout from the blueprints Butcher had provided, dropped down 3 levels, and found himself in a corridor that looked like every other medical research hallway except for the armed guards stationed every 30 feet. Security this dense meant something worth protecting, or something dangerous enough to require containment. Mark bypassed the guards by moving through the ceiling. Found an observation room overlooking what the facility maps labeled as Containment Lab 7. Pressed himself against the acoustic tiles and looked down through the one-way glass that let researchers watch experiments without being watched themselves. The lab was clean room certified. Air pressure maintained at negative to prevent contamination escape. Personnel in full biohazard suits moving with the careful precision of people who knew that one mistake would kill them in ways that weren't quick. And in the center behind triple-sealed containment were rows of vials filled with something that looked like ordinary saline, but carried labels Mark could read even from this distance. Project Terminus, Stage 3, authorized personnel only, extreme biohazard. The virus. The thing Vought had created to maintain ultimate control over the superhumans they'd spent decades producing. The final insurance policy that said even if every soup on Earth turned against them, the company would still hold the power to end the game. He could destroy it. could tear through the containment and crush every vial before anyone stopped him. But destroying the virus without knowing how many backup samples existed, without proof of Vought's intent to deploy it, would only give them a story about dangerous sabotage by an uncontrolled superhuman. He needed evidence first. Breaking the lab gave them ammunition. Proof took away their story. Mark felt something cold settle in his chest. Not fear. Something closer to recognition. He'd heard this logic before. Had watched his father explain why Viltrumite conquest was inevitable, necessary, the only rational response to a universe that wouldn't submit voluntarily. Had listened to arguments about greater goods and acceptable losses, and why some species needed to be controlled or eliminated for their own benefit. The Empire always started with good intentions, always claimed necessity, always framed genocide as mercy, and it always sounded reasonable until you were the one being erased. A door opened below. Two researchers entered, one carrying a tablet that displayed infection models and casualty projections. They moved to a console and activated the lab's internal communication system standard protocol for simulation briefings, where data needed to be shared with observation personnel. Their voices carried through the intercom speakers mounted in the ceiling, clear and clinical. The simulations are still showing unacceptable variance. One researcher pointed at graphs that tracked viral spread patterns across population centers. We can't guarantee containment to superhuman targets only. Spillover risk in baseline populations remains non-zero in every urban deployment model we've run. That's within acceptable parameters for a worst-case activation. The second researcher zoomed in on molecular structures that looked like microscopic weapons. The boards made it clear if the situation deteriorates to the point where deployment becomes necessary, baseline human casualties are preferable to losing control of the superhuman population. You're talking about millions of deaths. I'm talking about preventing billions. If superhumans decide to stop cooperating with social order, if they recognize their collective power and choose to exercise it against baseline humanity, we'd be looking at species-level extinction. The researcher set down the tablet. This virus is the only leverage we have. The only thing that keeps the strongest people on Earth from realizing they don't need the rest of us. Mark's hands clenched. The acoustic tile cracked slightly under his grip. He forced himself to breathe slowly to not give away his position through anger that wanted to express itself physically. They weren't wrong about the power differential. Weren't wrong that someone like Homelander could kill thousands before conventional weapons stopped him. Weren't even necessarily wrong that some kind of deterrent needed to exist. But they were wrong about the solution. Wrong to think that threatening everyone with extinction was different from the tyranny they claimed to prevent. Wrong to believe that fear was a foundation stable enough to build civilization on. He'd seen what happened when power decided that survival required domination. Had watched planets burn because Viltrumites concluded that cooperation was optional and conquest was efficient. Had carried the weight of knowing that his own bloodline represented exactly the kind of threat these researchers feared. The difference was choice. Mark had chosen not to be the thing his genetics prepared him to become. Had chosen to believe that strength could serve rather than rule, could protect rather than dominate. These researchers had made a different choice. Had decided that the possibility of tyranny justified creating the means of genocide, that fear of what might happen excused preparing to kill everyone just in case. One of the researchers checked a readout, frowned. We're still seeing instability in the viral envelope. Mutation rate exceeds design parameters. If we deploy at current stability levels, there's a 38% chance the virus evolves beyond our ability to control it. Then we keep refining until we hit acceptable margins. We have time. The superhuman who's causing all this concern. The files say he's not compound V based. The virus might not even affect him. That bought them exactly nothing. Mark could survive the apocalypse they were planning, which meant, from Vought's perspective, he represented a threat that couldn't be eliminated even with their ultimate weapon. That made him more dangerous in their calculations, not less. He needed evidence. Something more concrete than the vials locked behind containment glass, something that would prove intent and planning, beyond hypothetical deterrence. Mark moved through the ceiling space until he found the facility's data center drop down into a server room that hummed with cooling fans and backup generators. The security was corporate standard. Firewalls and encryption and monitoring systems designed to stop baseline human hackers. Not designed to stop someone who could physically access the hardware, pull drives, and copy data faster than the alert systems could register the intrusion. Mark worked quickly. Grabbed storage devices that held research logs, deployment scenarios, board meeting minutes where executives discussed casualty projections like quarterly earnings reports. The moment he touched the drive's tamper sensors logged the physical access. He knew it. Knew that somewhere automated alerts were notifying security that air-gapped systems had been breached. Knew he was trading stealth for evidence, betting that what he carried out would be worth the hunt that followed. He stuffed the drives into the bag he'd brought specifically for this purpose. Every second he spent here increased the chance of discovery. But he needed enough documentation to make the exposure undeniable. An alarm cut through the facility. Not the blaring siren of a security breach, but a softer tone that carried more urgency. Automated voice announcing containment protocol. Alpha 7. Mark looked up, realized what had happened. His body temperature ran higher than baseline human Viltrumite metabolism, generating heat that the facility's thermal sensors had finally flagged as an anomaly in spaces that should have been empty. Someone had noticed the temperature variance, had run diagnostics, had realized the observation areas had been compromised by something that registered as alive, but shouldn't exist in the ceiling voids. The server room door sealed with a hydraulic hiss. Steel shutters dropped over the ventilation access points Mark had planned to use for egress. Emergency lighting activated, bathing everything in red that made the shadows deeper and the escape routes fewer. Mark could tear through the barriers easily enough, but doing so would alert every guard in the facility, would create the kind of confrontation that ended with people hurt or dead, would give Vought exactly the violent incident they needed to justify their narrative about dangerous, uncontrolled superhumans. He needed a different approach. The ventilation system was sealed, but the cooling infrastructure wasn't. Server rooms generated heat that required constant management, which meant coolant lines running through the walls, connecting to external heat exchangers. Mark found the access panel, peeled it open, and discovered pipes large enough to navigate if he was willing to endure tight spaces and temperatures that would give baseline humans hypothermia. He was willing. The journey through the cooling system took longer than flight would have required, contorting through angles that tested even Viltrumite flexibility. But it got him past the lockdown barriers and into the building's peripheral systems. He emerged in a mechanical room that smelled like machine oil and ozone, found a service exit that led to the parking structure, and was gone before security finished searching the compromised areas. Outside night air that felt warm after the coolant pipes. Mark flew low, staying beneath radar coverage, heading for the rendezvous point, where the boys would be waiting with questions and accusations and whatever judgment they'd formed about his methods. He found them in an abandoned subway station 3 miles from the facility. Annie had set up portable lights that created pools of illumination in the darkness. Huey was reviewing footage on a laptop, checking the feeds from cameras they'd positioned around the facility perimeter. Was cleaning a weapon with methodical care that suggested the ritual mattered more than the maintenance. And Butcher was coughing into a rag that came away bloodier than last time. Did you get it? Butcher's voice was rougher than it had been yesterday, the Temp 5 erosion accelerating. The virus, the research, the proof. Mark pulled the storage drives from his bag, set them on the makeshift table someone had assembled from shipping pallets. Everything. Research logs, deployment scenarios, board minutes, where they discuss acceptable casualty rates for civilian populations. Annie reached for the drives, then stopped. How bad is it? Bad enough that they're planning for millions of baseline human deaths as collateral damage. Bad enough that they call it acceptable parameters. The group fell silent. Even in a world where Vought's corruption was assumed, where corporate evil was the baseline expectation, the scale of what Mark described carried weight that settled on everyone present. Huey broke the silence. They'd really kill that many people? To maintain control of superhuman assets, Mark met his eyes. Yes, and they'd call it necessary. Would frame it as preventing something worse. Would convince themselves they were saving humanity by preparing to cull it. That's the thing about empires. Butcher lit a cigarette despite Annie's glare. They always find a reason why the slaughter is justified. Always dress genocide up in language that makes it sound like defense. He turned to Mark, and his expression carried something that might have been respect, or might have been the recognition of kindred damage. You've seen this before, haven't you? The way power justifies itself. Mark thought about Omni-Man, about watching his father try to make planetary conquest sound like charity, try to convince him that forcing billions into submission was somehow different from killing them. Thought about the moment he'd realized that strength could be wrapped in beautiful rhetoric and still represent nothing more than the tyranny of those who refuse to see other options. Yes, I've seen how it starts. Seen the logic that turns protection into domination. Seen good intentions become weapons sharper than any blade. And what did you do when you saw it? I chose differently. The words hung in the space between them. Butcher studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. That's the real question, innit? Whether you repeat the pattern or break it. Whether you become the thing you've got the power to be, or choose to be something else despite the cost. Mark looked at the storage drives containing Vought's apocalypse. At the people around him, who'd been fighting this battle longer than he'd been in this world. At Butcher slowly dying from the same kind of shortcut logic that said ends justified means, and power excused methods. We expose this. Make it public. Make Vought defend the decision to create a doomsday weapon. And when the public doesn't care, Huey's voice carried the exhaustion of someone who'd learned that truth didn't always win. When they spin it as necessary security measures or defense against superhuman threats, then we destroy the virus ourselves. Mark's voice was flat. But we don't use it. We don't become the thing we're fighting just because it's effective. Butcher's laugh turned into a cough that took 10 seconds to subside. You really believe that? That there's a way to fight monsters without becoming one? I have to. Because the alternative is accepting that might makes right, that strength determines morality, that anyone powerful enough can do whatever they want. Mark looked at the data they'd gathered, at the evidence of Vought's willingness to commit genocide rather than lose control. And I've already fought one war against that philosophy. I'm not interested in proving it correct by becoming another example. Annie began copying the drives, creating redundant backups that would make the data impossible to suppress completely. Started planning exposure strategy, identifying journalists who might have enough independence to report honestly. Huey set up encryption for distribution channels that would survive Vought's inevitable attempts at suppression. And Butcher watched Mark with the expression of someone seeing a version of himself that had chosen differently. At a critical junction, a road not taken that led somewhere other than self-destruction and dying slowly from poison accepted voluntarily. Question, mate. Butcher's voice was quiet enough that the others couldn't hear. This virus, the researchers said it might not affect you. Might not work on someone who's not compound V-based. Mark nodded. I heard. So you could let us deploy it. Could stand back while we burn through every soup Vought's created, including Homelander, including the Seven. Could solve the problem without getting your hands dirty. Butcher took a drag from his cigarette eyes sharp, despite the dying body they occupied. Your old man ever tell you genocide was necessary too? That culling the weak was mercy. The silence stretched. Mark didn't answer immediately. The question had teeth precisely because Butcher knew it would. Because Omni-Man had used exactly that logic, had dressed planetary conquest in language about efficiency and inevitable progress, and why some species needed guidance that looked suspiciously like extinction. They hold, Mark said finally. The principles, they hold even when they're inconvenient. Good, because that's the difference between heroes and the cunts who wear the costume. One of them means it when they say every life matters. The other just likes how it sounds. Outside, dawn was beginning to turn the eastern sky gray. The night's work, complete evidence, gathered choices made about which lines wouldn't be crossed, no matter how expedient the crossing might be. Mark looked at the data they'd compiled. At proof that Vought had created the means to end the superhuman age, had calculated acceptable losses in populations that would never know they'd been designated as expendable. This ends, he said quietly. The virus gets destroyed. The research gets exposed. And the people who thought genocide was acceptable policy learn what consequences feel like when power stops being theirs. Legally, publicly, and if they force it physically. Butcher raised his flask in mock salute. To burning down empires without becoming emperors ourselves. Fucking miracle if we pull it off. They had the evidence. They had the plan. They had the moral clarity to know that some weapons were too dangerous to exist no matter who controlled them. What they didn't have was certainty that any of it would matter. But they had something else. Something Vaught's researchers hadn't calculated into their models and couldn't account for in their projections. They had someone who had already refused an empire once, who'd chosen to serve rather than rule to protect, rather than dominate to break the pattern that said strength and tyranny were synonyms. And sometimes in a world built on fear and control and the commodification of heroism, that was enough to change the equation. Sometimes, Vought Tower looked different at night. During business hours, it projected corporate legitimacy glass and steel catching sunlight in ways that suggested transparency while revealing nothing. After dark, it became what it actually was, a monument to power that didn't need daylight to justify itself. Mark approached from the east, flying low enough to stay beneath commercial radar coverage, but high enough to see the security preparations Vought had made since the facility breach. Drone coverage had tripled. Rooftop positions held teams with weapons designed to punch through reinforced materials. The building's electromagnetic signature suggested they'd activated countermeasures that would scramble most surveillance equipment within a 3-block radius. They knew he was coming. Knew the moment he'd touched those drives that exposure was inevitable unless they controlled the narrative faster than he could release it. The question wasn't whether Mark would show up. The question was whether they could turn his arrival into the kind of public disaster that discredited everything he might reveal. Annie's voice crackled through the earpiece Mark had agreed to wear. We're in position. Cameras on 3 buildings with clean sight lines. Wired connections and analog backup. Their electromagnetic countermeasures won't touch us. Whatever happens, we document it. Don't get caught in the crossfire, Mark said. That's our job. You just focus on not giving them footage they can use. The boys were scattered across the surrounding blocks with equipment that would capture angles Vought couldn't control or suppress. Every major news network had received anonymous tips about a major event at Vought Tower, complete with just enough detail to get cameras positioned, but not enough to let Vought spin the story before it started. And the data drop research files, deployment scenarios, board minutes was scheduled to go live at 11:17, regardless of what happened to Mark. Even if they killed him, the truth would post. This was information warfare. The kind of battle where truth mattered less than who told the story first and loudest. Mark descended toward Vought Tower's main entrance. Not subtle, not covert. He landed on the plaza with controlled precision, absorbing the impact through his legs, rather than letting it crack the decorative stonework. Even now, even coming to expose their crimes, he was aware that every action would be filmed and weaponized. First frame they'll use if I give them destruction footage. The doors were already open. Security stood aside. They wanted him inside where cameras could capture every moment, where the environment could be controlled, where his actions could be framed through architecture and lighting and the careful staging of corporate power. Mark walked through doors designed to make visitors feel small. Crossed a lobby where every surface reflected light in ways that made navigation disorienting for anyone who didn't know the space intimately. The elevators were disabled. The stairwells were sealed. They wanted him to go up so naturally, that's exactly where he went. Not through their planned route. Through the infrastructure they didn't expect him to use. Mark found a maintenance shaft, tore through the security grating, and flew up the elevator channels. Past floor after floor of offices where overtime workers still sat at desks, pretending they didn't know something was happening. Emerged 3 levels below the executive suites where Vaught's operational command existed. The war room's door was reinforced steel designed to stop conventional breaches, but the security outside was conspicuously absent. They'd pulled guards back deliberately, creating a corridor that led exactly where they wanted him to go. Mark understood the trap if they needed him, inside their controlled environment, needed the confrontation to happen on their terms, but he went anyway because refusing to engage meant they'd won by default. He gripped the door frame, applied pressure that bent metal like cardboard, and walked through an opening that hadn't existed 5 seconds earlier. 12 executives turned to stare at him. Behind them, wall-mounted screens showed camera feeds from across the city, data streams tracking social media sentiment in real-time threat assessments, updating faster than baseline humans could read. Mark pulled the storage drives from under his jacket, set them on the conference table with enough care to make it clear he wasn't here to destroy, just to expose. Project Terminus. Viral weapon targeting superhumans. Deployment scenarios, calculating acceptable civilian casualties in the millions. Board minutes where you discuss genocide like it was a quarterly earning strategy. All of it backed up and distributed to journalists who will publish regardless of what happens to me. The CEO, a woman whose face Mark recognized from press conferences where she'd promised accountability and transparency, didn't flinch. Very dramatic and completely irrelevant. We have a crisis management team already drafting responses. By tomorrow morning, this will be reframed as responsible contingency planning for superhuman threats, as evidence that Vaught Chamat takes public safety seriously enough to prepare for worst-case scenarios. You're admitting you built a doomsday weapon. We're admitting we fulfill our obligation to protect society from existential risks. She gestured at the screens showing Mark's previous encounters, footage edited to emphasize property damage and civilian fear. You've demonstrated exactly why such measures are necessary. An uncontrolled superhuman operating without oversight, without accountability, attacking private facilities, and stealing classified research. I attacked a genocide lab. You attacked a medical research facility developing defensive countermeasures. The CEO's expression never changed, voice maintaining the same corporate smoothness that had sold lies to investors for decades. The question isn't what you found, Mr. Grayson. The question is how your actions will be perceived by a public that's already frightened of what you represent. Mark started to respond. That's when the alerts began. Every screen in the war room shifted to emergency broadcasts. Multiple incidents across the city happening simultaneously. An explosion at a subway station, a chemical spill in the financial district, a superhuman designation unknown attacking emergency responders in the warehouse district. And in each location, camera crews were already positioned, ready to document, ready to broadcast. Mark's blood went cold. You orchestrated this. Multiple crisis points to divide my attention. The CEO smiled for the first time. We created opportunities for you to demonstrate whether you're a hero or a threat. Choose wisely. Because every decision you make tonight will be recorded from a dozen angles and replayed for an audience of millions. How many people die while you prove your point? That depends entirely on how quickly you can save them, and whether the 7 arrive first. On the screens, Homelander appeared at the subway explosion. Perfect timing, perfect positioning for the cameras. His expression conveyed concern and determination in proportions focus-tested for maximum public approval. He was saving people with the kind of visible effort that made heroism look difficult, made the audience feel grateful for his strength. Mark was already moving. Tore through the window, ignored the spray of glass, flew toward the nearest crisis point, the chemical spill. 3 blocks. He covered the distance in seconds, landed at a scene where industrial solvents were flooding into storm drains that would carry poison into the water treatment system. People were running. Emergency crews were establishing perimeters. And the news helicopters were tracking every movement with cameras that would capture whatever came next. Mark didn't waste time on heroic speeches. He found the source of the spill, a ruptured tanker truck positioned in exactly the wrong place for maximum contamination spread. The rupture wasn't accidental damage. It was engineered, rigged with pressure sensors that would trigger secondary releases if the tanker shifted position. Moving it meant flooding an entire city block with industrial poison. The only option was to become a human plug and hold until hazmat could contain the flow properly. The chemicals burned against his suit ate through the fabric to touch skin that could tolerate heat and pressure, but still registered pain from concentrated industrial compounds. He held position while hazmat crews deployed containment. Held position while the burns spread across his shoulders and chest. Held position because moving meant the spill would reach the water system and poison thousands. A camera drone circled close. Mark knew what it was recording. Knew the narrative being constructed from footage of him standing in toxic waste, knew how easily this could be edited to suggest recklessness or grandstanding. But people were still evacuating. Emergency crews were still working, and the water system was still clean. He held. The containment took 8 minutes. By the time hazmat gave the all-clear signal, Mark's suit was shredded, and his exposed skin carried chemical burns that would heal within hours, but hurt like fire in the present. He flew before anyone could interview him, before the cameras could capture his face too clearly, before someone asked him to justify being there. The earpiece crackled. 2 more incidents. One's real, one's staged. The real ones at the construction site in Midtown collapsed the scaffolding workers trapped. The staged ones at the shopping complex, where they've got a soup throwing cars, but deliberately missing people. Annie's voice was tense. Homelander's handling the subway. A train took the warehouse. Deep's en route to the shopping complex. They're covering everything except the construction site, because that one doesn't have enough cameras. Mark changed trajectory mid-flight. The construction site was darker, fewer news crews, less opportunity for the kind of documented heroism Vought valued, which meant anyone trapped there was less valuable in the calculus of public relations, which meant they needed help more. He found the collapse, 10 floors of scaffolding twisted like a metal sculpture, workers pinned beneath steel that would crush them if it shifted wrong. No cameras except the security feeds that weren't broadcasting, no helicopters, no audience. Just people dying in darkness, while the city's attention was directed elsewhere. One worker was already dead when Mark reached him, crushed by debris that had fallen in the first moments of the collapse. The man's eyes were still open expression, frozen in the surprise that comes when manufactured crisis stops being theoretical and becomes fatal. They didn't design it to kill, Mark thought, as he moved to save the others. They just didn't care if it did. Mark worked fast. Lifted beams that would have required cranes and cutting torches. Pulled workers free one by one, checked for spinal damage before moving them, called for emergency medical while keeping the structure stable with one hand. A foreman with blood streaming from a head wound looked at him with eyes that didn't recognize celebrity, only desperation. "Who are you?" "Someone who helps." Mark pulled another worker free from the wreckage. "Get them clear of the site. The rest of this is coming down." Homelander's voice echoed across the city, amplified through news broadcasts Mark could hear on radios the emergency crews carried. Tonight we've seen what happens when unregulated superhumans operate without coordination. While the Seven responded to multiple crises with precision and professionalism, others have chosen to act independently, creating confusion and potential liability. Mark ignored the speech, kept working. The structure groaned, metal stressed beyond tolerances, ready to complete its collapse. He braced the central support column, used his body as a temporary load-bearing element, while the last 3 workers were extracted. The column buckled. Mark flew clear as 10 floors of scaffolding thundered down in a controlled collapse that would have killed anyone still trapped, but instead just created a debris field where wreckage had already existed. The workers were all clear, all alive, all saved by someone who hadn't stopped to check if cameras were watching. Mark's earpiece crackled with static, then MM's voice. Shopping complex Soup was arrested. Subway rescue complete. Chemical spill contained. The city's seeing Homelander as the hero coordinating response, while you're the rogue element causing chaos. Because I saved people instead of performing, Mark said. Because you let them control the story. Annie's voice carried frustration. We got footage of the construction site rescue, but it's not being broadcast. Networks are running Vought's narrative. You're being positioned as the chaos element, the Seven, as the stable response. Mark flew higher, looked down at the city lit by emergencies that had been manufactured to serve a narrative. Every crisis resolved. Every person saved, every moment of genuine heroism happening in shadows while choreographed rescues played under spotlights. The earpiece crackled again. This time, it was a voice Mark hadn't expected. Homelander speaking on an open channel that every news helicopter and emergency frequency could hear. To the unidentified superhuman who's been interfering with professional rescue operations, you've made your point. You're strong, you're fast. But strength without structure is just violence waiting to happen. Homelander's voice carried that particular tone of someone offering reasonable compromise while preparing to crush dissent. Stand down. Let the Seven handle this. Before someone gets hurt because you decided rules don't apply to you. Mark activated his own transmission, knowing every camera that could pick up the signal would. I'll stand down when Vought stops manufacturing crises to make their heroes look necessary. When they stop using people as props in their public relations theater. When they answer for creating a biological weapon designed to commit genocide. The city went quiet. The kind of silence that happens when something important and unrehearsable happens on live television. Homelander's voice came back harder. You're making accusations you can't prove while interfering with legitimate emergency response. You're exactly the kind of threat Vought exists to protect people from. The data went live 3 minutes ago. Research files, deployment scenarios, board minutes. Already public, already spreading. Check the networks if you don't believe me. All of it showing exactly what Vought's willing to do to maintain control. On the streets below in homes across the city, people were opening links that had flooded social media feeds, reading documents that spelled out apocalypse in clinical language. We're seeing casualty projections and deployment maps and board discussions where human life had been reduced to acceptable loss margins. The narrative was escaping Vought's control. Not because Mark had won the argument, but because he'd released evidence that forced people to choose what they believed. And the boys scattered across the city with cameras that had captured everything were uploading footage that showed both sides. Homelander performing rescues while cameras rolled. Mark saving construction workers in darkness where heroism didn't photograph well. The Seven coordinating with precision. Mark operating alone and off script. The truth didn't look like either side wanted it to. It looked messy and complicated and resistant to simple stories about heroes and villains. Homelander appeared in Mark's sightline, hovering 50 feet away with an expression that had abandoned media-friendly concern for something much more dangerous. You just declared war. I declared transparency. Mark met his gaze without blinking. There's a difference. Not to me. Homelander's eyes began to glow. Not to Vought. Not to the people who understand that order requires someone strong enough to enforce it. The heat vision lanced out. Mark moved faster than Homelander expected, and the beam cut through empty air where he'd been hovering. The second beam came faster, tracking Mark's motion, forcing him to dodge instead of close distance. They fought above the city. Not the kind of fight that made good television, not the choreographed exchanges where punches landed with dramatic timing. This was faster, uglier two beings moving at speeds that made cameras blur trying to track them. Mark didn't try to hurt Homelander. Didn't need to win the fight, just needed to demonstrate that Homelander couldn't win it either. He dodged heat vision-absorbed punches that would have killed baseline humans and kept pulling the fight higher and away from populated areas whenever Homelander tried to maneuver toward building clusters. Every redirect was calculated. Keep collateral minimal. Keep the demonstration clean, prove superiority through restraint rather than destruction. He returned force with enough control to humiliate rather than injure. The moment that defined everything came when Homelander tried a move designed for cameras. A double-handed overhead strike that looked impressive and telegraphed itself from 3 seconds away. Mark caught both wrists, held Homelander in place with strength that made the man's muscles scream. And then gently, but firmly, he pulled Homelander down until they were face to face. "You need people to fear you to exist," Mark said quietly. "I don't," he pushed. Not hard enough to injure, just hard enough to send Homelander tumbling backward through the air control, lost the performance, interrupted by physics. The cameras caught it all. Homelander recovering his flight, his composure, his expression. But for 3 seconds, the most powerful superhuman in America had looked helpless. Had been physically dominated by someone who didn't need their approval or their system or their carefully managed image. For 3 seconds, the myth had cracked. Homelander retreated. Not fleeing, but pulling back to regroup to let Vaught's damage control teams craft new narratives around what had just happened. He spoke as he withdrew, voice carrying across open frequencies. "This isn't over. You can't fight the entire system. Can't win against everything we've built." "Watch me," Mark said. But he was wrong, and somewhere deep down he knew it. Because the system didn't need to beat him. It just needed to outlast him. Needed to keep spinning stories and manufacturing crises and making people choose between comfortable lies and uncomfortable truths. Mark descended to street level, landed in an intersection where emergency lights painted everything in shades of red and blue. People watched him. Some with fear, some with hope. Some with the blank expression of individuals who had just had their understanding of reality destabilized and were waiting for someone to tell them what to believe. The news was already fracturing into competing narratives. Some outlets praised Mark's exposure of Vaught's virus program. Others condemned his interference with official rescue operations. Some called him a hero. Some called him a threat. The truth was drowning in interpretations, each version equally confident and contradictory. Annie appeared beside him, no longer in costume, just Annie in January in civilian clothes, with her phone recording everything. "You did it. You exposed them. It's out there now. And tomorrow, half the country will believe it's fake," Mark said. "We'll trust Vaught's spin over documented evidence. We'll choose the comfortable story over the true one, maybe." Annie lowered her phone. "But the other half won't. The other half will see what you showed them and demand answers. That's something. That's more than we had yesterday." Mark looked at the city, at the towers of glass and steel where decisions about acceptable casualties were made in conference rooms with good lighting. At the streets below where people lived with the consequences of those decisions without ever seeing the calculations. He'd exposed the conspiracy, had revealed the apocalypse waiting in Vaught's labs, had demonstrated that Homelander could bleed and lose and look small. And the world was dividing in response. Not neatly, not into clear sides of right and wrong, but into 1,000 different interpretations of the same events, each person choosing the story that fit their existing beliefs about power and heroism, and whether truth mattered more than comfort. This is what winning looks like, Mark thought. Not triumph, just more questions. Somewhere in Vought Tower, executives were already drafting responses, already preparing the next move in a game that didn't end when truth came out. Because truth had never been the victory condition. The real battle wasn't for facts. It was for what people did with them, and that battle had no clear ending. The first 24 hours after the data drop, the internet exploded with competing analyses. Experts authenticated the documents. Other experts declared them fabricated. News networks ran split-screen debates where both sides cited the same evidence and reached opposite conclusions. Social media fractured into ecosystems of belief, each one convinced the others were deluded or complicit. Mark watched it happen from a rooftop in the warehouse district, the same abandoned factory where he'd slept before Vought sent their Temp 5 soldiers. The chemical burns from the tanker spill had healed, leaving skin that looked like it had never been touched by industrial poison. But something else hadn't healed: the understanding that exposing truth didn't guarantee people would accept it. His phone buzzed constantly with notifications he didn't read. Interview requests, threats, support from people who'd made him their symbol without asking permission. He'd turned off most of the alerts, but enough leaked through to paint a picture of a country tearing itself apart over questions it should have been asking decades ago. Annie found him as the sun set on the second day. She landed beside him without the costume, just civilian clothes and an expression that carried exhaustion deeper than physical tiredness. "Homelander's holding a rally tomorrow," she said without preamble. "Independence Hall. He's calling it a defense of American values against foreign interference and unregistered threats." Mark looked at her. "Foreign interference. I'm from Earth. Different Earth, apparently. Close enough for Vaught's narrative purposes." Annie sat on the roof edge legs, dangling over a drop that would kill baseline humans. "They're spinning you as an interdimensional invader. A threat that proves why America needs. The Seven needs. Vought needs strong leadership willing to make hard choices. And people believe it. Half of them. The other half sees you as proof that Vaught's been lying about everything." Annie pulled out her phone, showed him footage from protests that had turned violent. Pro-Vought demonstrators clashing with people demanding the company's dissolution. Police trying to maintain order while not knowing which side represented law. Neither group is interested in nuance. Everyone wants a simple story. What's Homelander actually planning to make himself untouchable? Annie scrolled through intelligence. Had compiled security preparations that suggested the rally was cover for something else. He's going to use your exposure of the virus as justification for emergency measures. Position himself as the only thing standing between civilization and chaos. And based on polling, about 43% of the country will support him doing it. Mark stood, looked out at the city where millions of people were choosing sides based on which narrative made them feel safer. "I can't let him turn this into dictatorship with applause. You might not be able to stop it." Annie's voice carried the weight of someone who'd watched too many battles end badly. "This isn't a fight you can win with strength. It's about what people want to believe. And a lot of them want to believe the strong man will protect them, even if he's the thing they need protection from. Then I go anyway. Make it clear there's someone who won't bow." "That's what Butcher said you'd say." Annie stood. "He also said it's what Homelander's counting on. That you showing up gives him exactly the enemy he needs to justify whatever comes next. So I stay away and let him win by default." "You show up and let him win with better footage?" Annie met his eyes. "There's no good option here, Mark. That's what we've been trying to tell you. This world doesn't reward heroes. It devours them and uses the scraps to sell whatever story profits most." The rally happened at noon. Independence Hall steps filled with people waving flags and wearing Homelander merchandise, a crowd that had been organized with the efficiency of a political campaign and the fervor of a religious movement. News helicopters circled. Cameras positioned at angles that would make everything look larger, more significant, more like destiny manifest. Homelander stood at the podium in full costume cape, catching wind in a way that seemed choreographed by the weather itself. His speech was everything Annie had predicted: strong leadership, American values, the need for order in chaotic times. He spoke about threats, foreign and domestic, about people who questioned authority being manipulated by forces that wanted to see the nation weakened. And then he spoke about Mark, an interdimensional intruder, operating without oversight, attacking American institutions, stealing classified research and releasing it to create division and fear. Homelander's voice carried that particular cadence of someone who'd practiced every inflection, every pause, designed for maximum emotional impact. Mark watched from 3 blocks away, standing on a rooftop with the boys, all of them observing through binoculars and camera feeds that showed the rally from angles the official broadcasts wouldn't cover. "He's good," Huey said quietly. "I mean, we know he's lying, but he's really good at it. Practice." Adjusted his camera focus. Years of selling bullshit to people who want to buy it. He knows his audience. Butcher took a long drink from his flask, hands shaking more than yesterday. The disease progressing by hours now, rather than days. Question is whether our boy goes down there and plays the part Homelander wrote for him. "I have to," Mark said. "Why?" Butcher turned to look at him, eyes carrying something that might have been genuine curiosity. "Why play their game at all? You could leave. Fly away to wherever you came from. Let this world sort its own shit, because that's what they want." Mark watched Homelander work the crowd, watched people cheer for their own subjugation, dressed up as security. If I run, everyone who believed the evidence just learns that truth doesn't matter when power decides otherwise. And if you fight, you become the boogeyman he's selling. The uncontrolled threat that proves America needs a superhuman dictator to keep them safe. Butcher coughed into his rag, bloodier than before. "Either way, Homelander wins. That's the game. That's what the boys has always been watching, the powerful win, regardless of how badly they deserve to lose." "So what would you do?" Butcher smiled without humor. "I'd use the virus. Kill every soup on the planet and let the chips fall. But we've established you've got principles about genocide, so that's off the table." Mark looked at the flask in Butcher's hand. At the man dying by degrees to fight a battle that couldn't be won cleanly. At the choice between becoming the monster in someone else's story or letting the actual monster write history unopposed. Below, Homelander was building toward his crescendo, speaking about strength and leadership and the courage to do what needed doing. The crowd was responding with the kind of enthusiasm that came from people who'd been frightened for so long they'd accept any promise of safety, any authority figure confident enough to claim they had answers. Mark made his decision. He flew, not toward the rally, toward Homelander, specifically trajectory calculated to avoid the crowd's speed enough to announce arrival, but controlled enough to prevent panic. He landed on the steps of Independence Hall with the kind of precision that had become reflexive, stood in front of podium and cameras, and thousands of people who'd been told he was their enemy. The crowd noise died. Homelander's speech stopped mid-sentence. For 3 seconds, the silence was absolute. Then Homelander smiled. Exactly the expression someone wears when their opponent has walked into a carefully laid trap. "Ladies and gentlemen, the threat I've been warning you about." Homelander's voice carried across the plaza, amplified by speakers recorded by every camera present, showing up to prove that those who don't respect our institutions will simply take what they want through force. Mark ignored him, spoke directly to the cameras, to the audience, beyond the crowd, to anyone still willing to hear something other than the narrative being sold. "I'm not here to fight. I'm here because someone needs to stand in front of this and say no. No to accepting fear as policy. No to trading freedom for the promise of safety from threats your protectors create. No to letting power justify itself through strength alone. You're here because you can't accept that people have chosen security over your version of freedom. Homelander descended the steps, positioning himself between Mark and the crowd. You're here because you think might makes right, that being strong means you know better than everyone else. I'm here because I've seen what happens when strength stops being questioned. Mark kept his voice level, kept his hands visible and unthreatening. I've seen empires built on the logic you're selling. Seen worlds burn because someone powerful decided their rule was inevitable. And I've seen that the only thing stopping tyranny is people willing to say it's wrong, even when saying it costs everything. Pretty speech. Homelander's eyes began to glow. But this is America. We don't take lectures from outsiders about how to govern ourselves. Then, don't take lectures. Take evidence. The virus development, the casualty projections, the board meetings where they calculated how many of you were acceptable losses. It's all public, all documented, all true regardless of how many times they call it fake. The crowd was murmuring, some angry, some uncertain, some looking at their phones where the data was still available, still readable, still presenting questions that simple narratives couldn't answer. Homelander saw the moment slipping, saw people thinking instead of cheering. And Mark watched the calculation happen in real time. The decision that violence would serve better than rhetoric, that demonstration of power, would reclaim narrative control more effectively than words. The heat vision came fast. Mark was faster. He moved, let the beam cut through empty air, and was behind Homelander before the man could track the motion. Not attacking. Just there, close enough to whisper something only Homelander would hear. You can't kill me. Can't beat me. Can't make me submit. And everyone watching knows it now. Homelander spun through a punch with everything behind it. Mark caught his fist, held it steady, applied just enough counter-pressure to stop the motion completely. The crowd saw their symbol of invincibility, frozen by someone who looked calm, controlled utterly unbothered by the strongest being they'd been told existed. Mark held the position for 5 seconds. Long enough for every camera to capture it. Long enough for the image to burn into social media and news coverage and the historical record. Then he let go, stepped back, spoke loud enough for the microphones to catch. I'm not your enemy, but I won't be your subject either. Figure out what you actually want, protection from power or protection by power, because you can't have both. He flew before Homelander could recover, before security could respond, before the narrative could be reclaimed through violence or staging. Left them with the image of America's strongest superhuman being, physically dominated by someone who'd chosen not to hurt him. The footage played on every channel, analyzed from every angle, interpreted through every possible lens. Half the country saw a dangerous outsider humiliating their protector. Saw proof that Homelander needed support, needed authority, needed whatever powers he claimed were necessary to counter threats like this. The other half saw their supposed defender rendered helpless by someone who'd chosen restraint over domination. Saw the difference between actual strength and performed invincibility. Both sides were certain they'd witnessed confirmation of what they already believed. Mark met the boys in the subway station hideout after the sun set. Found them reviewing footage, tracking social media response, measuring the distance between what happened and what people chose to see. Homelander's calling for emergency superhuman registration, reported. Federal authority to detain unregistered supes indefinitely. 47% approval in initial polling, and the other 53% Mark asked. Split between people demanding Vaught's prosecution and people who don't believe any of this is real. Annie looked exhausted. You embarrassed Homelander publicly, made him look weak. That doesn't make him go away. It makes him dangerous. More dangerous than he already was. Different dangerous. Desperate dangerous. Butcher set down his flask, the motion requiring more effort than it should. He can't beat you with strength, can't beat you with narrative, since half the country stopped believing him. So he'll escalate. Make the stakes high enough that winning costs more than losing. To what? Butcher pulled out a secure tablet, showed them surveillance from the research facility Mark had infiltrated. New activity, increased security, and telemetry suggesting they'd move the virus to an unknown location. They're preparing to deploy, Annie said quietly. If Homelander can't beat you, Vought will use their endgame option. They'd kill their own assets. They'd rather burn everything than lose control. MM's voice was flat. That's always been the play. We just gave them enough pressure to pull the trigger. Mark looked at the surveillance images, at evidence that exposing one conspiracy had triggered another, at proof that winning battles didn't mean winning wars when the enemy was willing to commit scorched earth rather than surrender power. Butcher coughed, the sound wet and painful. Then his expression hardened. I kept a sample from the facility before you arrived, just in case. You what? Annie's voice went sharp. Insurance. Butcher pulled a small containment vial from his jacket, the kind designed for biohazard transport. Thought you might make them see reason. Thought exposing them would matter. But I've been doing this longer than you, mate. Know how this ends. Know they'd rather blow it all up than let go. Mark stared at the vial, at the apocalypse in miniature, at the choice Butcher had made to keep the weapon he claimed to oppose. You can't use that. Watch me. Butcher's smile was terrible. If they deploy the virus, I deploy mine first. Controlled release. Target the real threats before their version kills everyone. That's not control. That's different genocide with better intentions, maybe. But it's the option I'm keeping. Because I've seen how this story ends, and it's not with truth winning. It's with power doing whatever it wants until someone powerful enough stops them. The hideout fell into silence, broken only by the distant rumble of trains in tunnels below. Mark stood among people who'd been fighting this battle long before he arrived, who'd learned that victory looked like damage mitigation rather than triumph. The world had seen evidence of Vought's crimes, had watched Homelander rendered physically helpless, had been given every reason to demand change, and half of them had chosen the comfortable lie anyway, had decided that strength without accountability was preferable to uncertainty with freedom. Mark had won every fight, had exposed every conspiracy, had demonstrated superiority over the strongest being in this version of America. And tomorrow, Homelander would still have power. Vought would still have resources. And the virus would still exist as the final guarantee that no one could challenge their control without risking everything. This is what winning looks like, Mark thought again. Not triumph, just different problems. Butcher pocketed the vial, lit a cigarette despite Annie's glare. Question for you, mate. You've embarrassed Homelander, exposed Vought, shown the world everything they are. What happens tomorrow when half of them vote to give Homelander more power anyway? Then I keep saying no. Mark met his eyes. Keep standing in front of it. Keep showing there's another option even when choosing it costs everything, even when it doesn't work, especially then, because the alternative is accepting that might makes right. That power justifies itself. That strength is the only thing that matters. Mark looked at each of them, and I've already fought one war against that philosophy. I'm not proving it correct by becoming another example. The boys said nothing, just watched him with expressions that carried different shades of the same emotion. Respect mixed with pity, admiration mixed with certainty that principles wouldn't be enough when Vought played their final card. Outside, America was dividing itself along lines drawn by competing narratives about the same objective truth. Homelander was consolidating power. Vought was preparing their apocalypse option. And Mark Grayson stood in a subway station with people who'd learned that fighting monsters sometimes meant accepting there were battles you couldn't win cleanly, but you fought them anyway, because the alternative was surrender. And some things were worse than losing. 3 days after Independence Hall, Vought announced new security partnerships with federal agencies, emergency protocols for superhuman incidents, oversight committees staffed by people who'd spent their careers defending the company. The infrastructure of authoritarianism, dressed in the language of public safety, sold to a population that had learned to fear the alternatives more than the cage. Mark watched the press conference from the same rooftop where this had started, where he'd first understood that this world operated on rules he couldn't punch through. The CEO spoke with the same corporate smoothness that had survived every scandal, every exposure, every moment where truth should have mattered, but didn't. We're entering a new era of accountability and cooperation. Her smile was perfect, practiced entirely hollow, working together with government partners to ensure that superhuman activity serves the public good rather than individual agendas. The translation was simple enough. Vought had won. Not because they'd beaten Mark in combat or discredited his evidence, but because they'd convinced enough people that controlled tyranny was preferable to uncertain freedom. That strength without accountability was order, and questioning that strength was chaos. Half the country agreed. The other half was learning that being right didn't matter when the other side held the weapons and the microphones and the willingness to use both. Annie found him as the sun began setting on the 4th day. She looked different, tired, in a way that went deeper than missed sleep, carrying the weight of someone who'd fought the same battle too many times to believe the outcome would ever change. "You're leaving." She said it as statement rather than question. Mark didn't deny it. The portal energy was showing up again. Same signature that pulled me here. It's unstable, but it's there. Probably only one shot at using it. When? Tonight. Maybe tomorrow. The window's narrow. Mark looked at the city spread below them, millions of lights, representing millions of people who'd chosen their stories and would live with the consequences. If I stay past it, I'm here permanently, and you're choosing to go. I'm choosing not to stay in a world that's made its decision. Mark's voice carried no judgment, just tired acceptance. I exposed the conspiracy, demonstrated that Homelander bleeds, showed everyone what Vought actually is, and half of them decided they preferred the lie anyway. The other half is still fighting. Annie's voice held the edge of someone who'd heard this logic before and rejected it. Still demanding accountability, still organizing, still believing things can change, with me or without me. She didn't answer immediately. When she did, her voice was quieter. With you, they have hope that someone powerful enough to challenge the system actually will. Without you, they have to do it themselves, which is what should have been happening all along. Mark turned to face her. I'm not a solution, Annie. I'm a temporary variable that delayed the inevitable. This world's problems aren't the kind strength solves. They're the kind people solve by choosing differently. And I can't make that choice for them. So you just leave them to it. I leave them to the same choice every civilization faces. Whether power serves people or people serve power. Whether truth matters enough to fight for when fighting is hard. Mark gestured at the city below. I've given them every tool they need. Evidence. Demonstration that their gods can be challenged. Proof that strength alone doesn't determine right. What they do with that is up to them. Annie pulled out her phone, showed him footage from protests that had turned into occupied zones from whistleblowers inside Vought, leaking new information daily from grassroots organizations forming around the evidence Mark had exposed. It's already happening. People are choosing differently, slowly, messily. But it's happening. Then they don't need me. They need to learn they can do this without someone stronger than their oppressors showing up to fight for them. The argument stretched into silence. Not angry silence, just the exhaustion of two people who wanted different things from the same outcome. Butcher appeared from the rooftop access door, moving slower than yesterday. The Temp 5 and the Cancer racing each other toward a finish line that would kill him regardless of which one. He carried a bottle rather than his usual flask, had apparently decided that measured doses no longer mattered when the ending was already written. Heard you're fucking off back to wherever you came from. His voice was rough, damaged by substances and choices that had seemed necessary at the time. Can't say I blame you. This world's proper shit. You could come. Mark said it without expectation, but with genuine offer. The portal's not stable, but if you're dying anyway, what's start over in a different universe where everything's just as fucked? But I don't know the players. Butcher took a long drink. Nah, mate. I've got unfinished business here, and someone needs to make sure Vought doesn't deploy their genocide without consequences. You still have the virus. Course I do. Butcher patted his jacket pocket. My insurance policy. They kill all the soups, I kill them first and make it public enough that the world knows what they did. Mutual assured destruction. The only language power actually respects. That's not justice. That's revenge dressed up as deterrence, maybe. But it's the option I'm keeping. Butcher met his eyes with the gaze of someone who'd stopped caring whether his methods were clean as long as they were effective. You get to leave with your principles intact. Someone's got to stay and get their hands dirty. MM and Huey emerged behind Butcher, followed by Kimiko. They looked like soldiers who'd just learned the war wouldn't end with this battle, that victory meant going home to fight the same enemies tomorrow without the advantage they'd briefly possessed. We'll keep the evidence circulating, MM said. Keep pressure on. Make sure what you exposed doesn't get memory hold. The organizations are growing. Huey pulled up statistics on his tablet petition signatures, donation flows to accountability groups, voter registration drives organized around demanding change. It's not nothing. It's just not enough yet. Kimiko signed something. Annie translated quietly. She says you showed them that power can be challenged. That matters even if the system survives. Mark nodded. Looked at each of them. People who'd been fighting this battle before he arrived and would continue after he left. People who'd learned that heroism meant showing up when the outcome was uncertain, rather than waiting for guaranteed victory. The virus, Mark said to Butcher. If you use it, millions die. Innocent people, baseline humans caught in the spread. You become exactly what you're fighting. And if I don't use it, Vought deploys theirs and millions die anyway. Butcher's smile was bitter. That's the game, mate. Choose which genocide you can live with, or choose to do nothing and let someone else pick. There's no clean option. There never was. Then choose not to deploy at all. Let them make the first move. Let them be the ones who cross that line. While people die, while you prove you're different from them. That some lines shouldn't be crossed no matter how justified the crossing seems. The conversation ended without resolution. Some arguments didn't have answers, just positions held by people who'd seen different hells and drawn different conclusions about what survival required. Mark spent his last hours in this world walking through the city at ground level. No flying. No demonstrations of power. Just moving among people who didn't know they'd briefly shared their world with someone from elsewhere. He listened to conversations about the news, about Vought, about whether Homelander was a hero or a threat. Heard people repeat talking points from both sides with equal conviction. Watched them choose comfort over truth, certainty over complexity, the familiar story over the difficult one. The portal energy was strongest near where he'd first arrived in the industrial district, where security cameras had long since been stripped for parts. Mark found the exact spot, could feel the dimensional weakness, like a wound in reality trying to heal. Annie came to see him off. Just her, no crowd, no audience. She carried a bag with supplies he wouldn't need, but that felt important to offer anyway. "You could stay," she said. "Keep fighting. Keep being the example they need." "I could." Mark looked at the shimmer in the air where the portal would manifest. "But then I become the crutch that keeps them from learning to walk on their own. Become the reason they don't develop their own strength. This world needs to choose whether it wants freedom badly enough to fight for it, without someone stronger doing the fighting for them. And if they choose wrong, then they live with that choice until they're ready to choose differently." Mark met her eyes. "I can't save a world that doesn't want to be saved. Can't fix a system people are addicted to despite knowing it's poisoning them. Can't fight battles for people who won't fight them for themselves. So you just leave. I leave them with evidence, an example, and the knowledge that power can be challenged. The rest is up to them." The dimensional tear began opening reality, peeling back to reveal something else beneath. Not another world visible through the gap, just the absence of this one, a doorway leading somewhere. Mark's arrival had been an accident, and his departure would be deliberate. Annie pulled a drive from her pocket. "Everything we recorded. Every angle Vought didn't control. Every moment of you showing them what heroes actually look like." She handed it to him. "In case you want to remember. Or in case your world needs to know what you did here." Mark took it, pocketed it. Knew he'd probably never watch the footage, but understood why she needed him to have it. "Tell Butcher not to use the virus unless Vought deploys first. Tell him revenge isn't the same as justice, even when it feels identical." "I will." Annie stepped back as the portal stabilized. "He won't listen, but I'll tell him. And tell everyone else that the fight was worth having even if the outcome wasn't clean." The portal was fully open now, humming with energy that pulled at Mark like gravity from another world. He could see nothing through it, except the promise of elsewhere, of home of a universe where his arrival hadn't been chance. And his presence didn't complicate moral equations already balanced on edges too sharp for comfort. "One last question," Annie said. "If you could do it over knowing how it ends, would you still expose them?" Mark thought about construction workers saved in darkness where cameras didn't reach. About people opening files that proved what they'd suspected but couldn't prove. About Homelander frozen for 3 seconds with his fist caught, his invincibility revealed as performance rather than truth. About evidence that would circulate for years past between people who refused to forget what they'd been shown. "Yes," he said. "Because some truths need speaking, even when speaking them doesn't change minds. Some stands need taking, even when taking them costs everything and achieves nothing." He stepped through the portal before sentiment could complicate departure. The transition was instant and nauseating reality twisting through dimensions that didn't have names in languages humans spoke. And then he was somewhere else, someone else, a version of Earth that felt like home in ways this one never had. The portal collapsed behind him, dimensional scar healing as if he'd never been there. In the world. Mark left behind the sun, rose on a 5th day after Independence Hall. Vought stock prices stabilized. Homelander held another rally where people cheered his promises of order and strength. The virus remained hidden in a facility whose location only a few people knew. And Butcher sat in the subway hideout with a vial of apocalypse in his pocket, watching news coverage of a world choosing comfortable tyranny over uncertain freedom. Knowing he held the power to end it all, and wondering whether he'd have the strength to not use it. The data Mark had exposed continued circulating. The footage of Homelander frozen continued spreading. The organizations demanding accountability continued growing, and half the country continued believing that none of it mattered. That strength was truth and power was right. And anyone who said different was either naive or dangerous. The world hadn't been saved. The system hadn't collapsed. The villains hadn't been defeated, and the heroes hadn't won. But the fight continued. Messily, incompletely, without guarantees or clean endings. Because some battles didn't end with victory. They ended with choice, whether to keep fighting when fighting seemed futile, whether to stand. When standing changed nothing, whether to speak truth when truth was drowned in comfortable lies. Mark had made his choice. Now the world he'd left behind would make theirs. And tomorrow the same battles would be fought by the same people, for the same stakes, with no superhuman from another dimension to tip the scales or carry weight that should have been shared by everyone willing to lift it. That was either tragedy or liberation, depending on who you asked and what they believed about the relationship between power and freedom. The answer wouldn't be clear for years, maybe decades, maybe never. But the question remained vibrating through a world that had been shown what it was, and now had to decide what it wanted to become. And that question was worth asking, even if the answer wasn't guaranteed, especially then.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel, and be sure to turn on notification so you won't miss our future video. Thank you for watching, and we will see you next time.